It was one of those chilly evenings in London, the kind where the wind cuts through your jacket no matter how thick it is. I had just finished a long day, feeling a bit drained, but I decided to stop by a local takeaway shop for some food. As I walked in, the smell of fried chicken and warm spices hit me, making my stomach growl. People were lined up, some chatting, others scrolling through their phones, waiting for their orders. It was just another ordinary night, until I saw him. At the far end of the counter, an old man stood hunched over, his thin fingers trembling as he counted a handful of pennies on the glass surface. His coat was too big for his frail frame, the edges tattered, and his shoes, if you could even call them that, were barely holding together. He looked exhausted, as if life had drained every ounce of energy from him. The cashier, a young guy barely in his 20s, glanced at him with impatience. "Sir, that's not enough for a meal," he said, his tone flat, almost bored. The old man didn't look up. Instead, he continued counting, his lips moving silently as he added up the coins again, hoping, maybe praying, that somehow he had miscalculated. I could see his shoulders rise and fall in a slow sigh. His hands were rough, skin cracked from the cold, the nails chipped and dirty. The people around him barely paid attention. A few stole quick glances, then went back to their own business. It was one of those moments where you realize how invisible someone can become when they have nothing left. I don't know what it was, but something about him hit me deep. Maybe it was the way his hands shook, or the way he kept his head down, as if he was trying to make himself smaller, hoping nobody would notice his struggle. Or maybe it was the sheer contrast, me standing there with enough money to buy anything on the menu while he was scraping together whatever he had just to get a single meal. "Sir, I can't hold up the line," the cashier said, his voice sharper this time. "Do you have anything else?" The old man slowly lifted his head. His eyes, tired, sunken, yet strangely full of dignity, met the cashier's for a brief second before he shook his head. "No, son," he murmured, barely above a whisper. "This is all I got." That's when I knew I couldn't just stand there. I stepped forward before I even realized what I was doing. "I got it," I said, pulling out my wallet. The cashier gave me a quick glance, then nodded, punching in the order without a second thought. But the old man, he just stood there, frozen. His fingers stopped moving over the coins, his eyes flickering between me and the meal he had just failed to afford. "You don't have to do that," he mumbled, his voice hoarse, as if it had gone unused for too long. "It's nothing, man. Just let me do this," I replied, offering a small smile. He hesitated for a moment, then finally nodded, his lips pressing together in something that wasn't quite a smile, but more like quiet relief. The cashier handed him the food, and I expected him to just take it and leave, the way most people do when they're shown a rare moment of kindness. But he didn't. Instead, he turned to me, his hands gripping the warm bag like it was something precious. "Can I sit with you?" he asked. I wasn't expecting that. But something in his voice, something raw, something desperate, made it impossible to say no. "Of course," I said, leading him to a table near the window. As he unwrapped his food, I could see how hungry he was. He tried to eat slowly, but his hands betrayed him, shaking as he lifted the burger to his mouth. He took one bite, then another, before finally pausing, as if realizing he should pace himself. He glanced at me, almost embarrassed. "Haven't eaten all day," he admitted. I nodded, giving him space. Then after a moment I asked, "What's your name?" "Leonard," he said, swallowing. "But most people just call me Lenny." "Nice to meet you, Lenny," I said. "I'm Michael." He nodded, as if repeating my name in his head. Then for a moment, he just stared at his food, lost in thought. "I wasn't always like this, you know," he finally said. I didn't say anything. I just let him talk. "Used to have a family," he continued. "A wife, a daughter, had a job too, good one, worked construction, hard work but honest." His voice was distant, like he was seeing something far beyond the walls of the takeaway shop. Then one day, everything just started falling apart. He took another bite, chewing slowly, as if it helped him gather his thoughts. "My wife got sick, cancer. We tried everything, spent every penny we had, sold the car, sold the house, anything to keep her alive. But it wasn't enough." He exhaled shakily. "She passed 2 years later." I felt a tightness in my chest. I didn't know what to say. My daughter! She was young, too young to understand. I tried to keep things together for her, but I was drowning. Got behind on bills, lost my job. Then the eviction notice came, one thing after another, and before I knew it, I was out here. He gestured vaguely towards the street, as if it explained everything. I wanted to say something, anything, but what do you say to a man who lost everything? "She's out there somewhere," he said quietly. "My daughter. Grew up, got a life of her own. I just hope she's happy." He looked down at his food again, his eyes glassy, but he blinked a few times, pushing back whatever emotions were threatening to surface. "I don't blame her, you know. She had to move on. But some nights, I wonder if she even remembers me." The weight of his words settled in the air between us. This wasn't just about hunger. This was about a man who had been forgotten by the world, by time, maybe even by his own family. And yet, despite everything, he still carried himself with dignity. I knew then this couldn't be the end of his story. I sat there, staring at Lenny as he poked at the last few fries in his tray, his mind clearly somewhere else. His story had left a heavy weight in the air between us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was supposed to do something more than just buy him a meal. I'd met a lot of people in my life, but there was something different about Lenny. This wasn't just a man who had fallen on hard times. This was a man who had lost everything, but was still holding on to the last shred of hope, even if it was buried under years of hardship. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. "Lenny," I said, my voice steady, "what if we change that?" He looked up at me, confused. "Change what?" "Your situation," I said. "What if tonight wasn't just another night? What if this was the beginning of something new?" He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Kid, I appreciate what you did for me, but let's be real. I've been out here too long. Nobody hires a washed-up old man with no address, no phone, no nothing." I nodded, understanding his doubt. The world wasn't kind to people like Lenny. Once you fall through the cracks, it's almost impossible to climb back up. But I wasn't about to let that be the end of his story. "You ever heard of Big Shaq?" I asked, a small smirk forming on my lips. Lenny frowned. "What, like the basketball player?" I laughed. "Nah, man, that's Shaquille O'Neal. I mean Big Shaq. Me." He studied me for a moment, as if trying to match my face to something familiar. "Wait, you're that guy from the internet, aren't you?" I shrugged. "Something like that." For the first time, I saw a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Well, what's a guy like you doing out here buying food for an old broke man like me?" "Because I can," I said simply. "And because I want to." Lenny exhaled, shaking his head again. "That's rare these days." "That's exactly why I want to do more," I said. "Listen, Lenny, I've got connections. I know people who can help, get you cleaned up, find you a place to stay, even help you land a job." His eyes darkened with doubt. "Why would you do that?" I leaned back, crossing my arms. "Because I can, and because you deserve a second chance." Lenny rubbed his temple, as if trying to process everything. I don't know, man. It's been so long. What if I mess up? What if I can't do it? I looked him dead in the eye. Then you try again. Silence stretched between us, the noise of the restaurant fading into the background. Lenny looked down at his empty tray, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. I could see the battle in his mind, the part of him that wanted to believe, and the part that had been beaten down for too long. Finally, he sighed. "All right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what's going to come of this, but all right." A grin spread across my face. That's all I need to hear. I pulled out my phone and sent a quick message to a friend who ran a shelter that helped people get back on their feet. "I got a place for you to stay tonight," I said. "First thing in the morning, we'll get you some fresh clothes, a hot shower, and a real meal. Then we'll talk about next steps." Lenny stared at me, blinking a few times as if trying to make sure this was real. Then slowly, he nodded. For the first time that night, I saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Hope. The night air was crisp as we stepped out of the fast food joint. Lenny pulled his worn-out coat tighter around his thin frame, glancing at me like he still wasn't sure if this was real. I could see it in his eyes, the hesitation, the disbelief. He had probably had his hopes lifted and shattered too many times before. "Where we headed?" he asked, his voice rough but laced with something I couldn't quite place. "I got a place for you to stay tonight," I told him, pulling out my phone to call an Uber. "It's a shelter run by a friend of mine. Good people, no questions asked. They'll help you get back on your feet." Lenny nodded slowly, his fingers twitching as if he was resisting the urge to hold on to something, maybe his doubt, maybe his fear. "You sure about this, kid?" I smirked. "Wouldn't be standing here if I wasn't." The ride was quiet. Lenny stared out the window, watching the city pass by like he was seeing it for the first time in years. The neon lights reflected off the glass, casting strange patterns on his weathered face. He looked tired. Not just physically, but the kind of tired that sits deep in a man's soul. When we pulled up in front of the shelter, he hesitated before getting out. "You coming in?" I nodded. "Yeah, let's get you settled." Inside, the place was warm, brightly lit, and filled with the low hum of conversation. A woman at the front desk looked up and smiled when she saw me. "Michael, didn't expect to see you tonight." "Hey, Lisa," I greeted her. "Got someone who could use a little help." Her gaze shifted to Lenny, and in that moment, something in her softened. She had seen plenty of people like him before, but she didn't treat them like statistics. She treated them like humans. "You're in the right place," she told him warmly. Lenny shifted on his feet, uncomfortable. I don't know about this." Lisa reached out and touched his arm gently. "Just take it one step at a time, okay?" After some paperwork and a few reassuring words, Lisa led Lenny to a private room, with a bed, a small dresser, and a bathroom. It wasn't much, but to a man who had been sleeping on cold concrete, it might as well have been a 5-star hotel. "You get some rest," I told him as he sat down on the bed, running a hand over the clean sheets. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what's next." Lenny looked up at me, something unreadable in his eyes. Then, after a long pause, he said, "Thank you." I just nodded. "Get some sleep, man." The next morning, I swung by the shelter with fresh clothes, shoes, and a proper breakfast. When I stepped into the common area, I almost didn't recognize Lenny. He was showered, clean-shaven, and dressed in the clothes I'd brought. He still looked like a man who had been through hell, but there was something different in his posture, stronger, more upright. "How you feeling?" I asked, handing him a coffee. He took a sip and let out a slow breath. Like I just woke up from a nightmare that lasted 20 years. I chuckled. Well, let's make sure you don't go back to it. The next step was finding him work. I had already made some calls, pulling some strings with a buddy who owned a construction company. They needed an extra pair of hands, and I figured it was worth a shot. When I told Lenny, his hands tightened around his coffee cup. You really think someone's going to hire me? You got skills, right? He nodded. Yeah, spent years on construction sites. I can still do the work. Then let's make it happen. A few hours later, we were standing in front of a job site. The foreman, a burly guy named Jake, eyed Lenny up and down before nodding. You ever handled heavy machinery before? Yeah, Lenny said confidently. Back in the day, I worked everything from cranes to bulldozers. Jake nodded again. All right, let's see what you got. Lenny was nervous. I could see it in the way he flexed his fingers, the way he exhaled sharply before stepping forward. But the moment he climbed into the driver's seat of a forklift and maneuvered it like he had never stopped, I knew. This wasn't just a second chance. This was the start of something new. Over the next few weeks, Lenny's transformation was nothing short of incredible. He worked hard, saved his money, and even started reconnecting with his past. One day, he sat across from me at a diner, staring at his phone with shaking hands. I found her, he whispered. It took me a second to realize what he meant. His daughter. She's in Chicago, he said. I don't know if she'll want to see me, but I have to try. I nodded. You should. A few days later, I bought him a plane ticket. As I stood at the airport, watching him disappear through the terminal, I realized something. This had started as just a simple act of kindness, a meal for a hungry man, but somehow it had turned into something bigger, something life-changing. As I watched Lenny disappear into the airport terminal, a strange feeling settled over me, something between pride and quiet reflection. I hadn't done anything grand, nothing that would make headlines or go viral. I had simply helped a man who needed it. But in that simplicity, something powerful had unfolded. Life has a way of pushing people to the edges, making them feel invisible, forgotten. Lenny had spent years believing he was too far gone, too broken to ever rebuild. But all it took was one moment, one act of kindness, to remind him that he still had a future. It made me wonder how many people walk past others in need without even seeing them. How many Lennys are out there, waiting for someone to acknowledge them, to believe in them when they can't believe in themselves? We live in a world where people are quick to judge, where struggling is seen as weakness, and where kindness is sometimes mistaken for naivety. But the truth is, kindness is powerful. It changes lives. It creates ripples that go further than we can ever imagine. Lenny had been given a second chance, but in a way, so had I. He reminded me of something I had almost forgotten, that the smallest actions can have the biggest impact, that helping someone doesn't require wealth or fame, just a willingness to care. A few weeks later, I got a call. It was Lenny. His voice was different this time, stronger, lighter. She wants to see me, he said, barely able to believe it himself. My daughter. She said she's willing to talk. I smiled. That's amazing, man. None of this would have happened without you, he said. I shook my head even though he couldn't see me. Nah, Lenny, you did the hard part. You chose to keep going. As I hung up, I realized this wasn't just his story. It was a reminder for all of us. We never know what someone is going through. We never know what a simple act of kindness might mean to them. And we never know how far a little bit of hope can take someone who's been living without it for too long. Sometimes changing the world doesn't mean doing something massive. Sometimes it just means helping one person get back on their feet. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough.